Welcome to Peninsula Symphony All-Stars at Home. Today we are visiting with Brian Holmes. Hello, Brian.
Greetings.
Nice to see you in your domicile, in your workplace, or at least one of your workplaces. Brian Holmes is co-principal French horn of the Peninsula Symphony, has been for many years, and is also, because he's a man of many talents, a superb composer and retired professor of physics at San Jose State University. And you might wonder why all of those three different pursuits connect to each other. And I think the core of that is music is sound in space, and there's physics that goes with it. And understanding that, I think, probably makes you a better musician. Do you think that's true?
It's hard to say. I think all the time I spend teaching physics is time that I'm not practicing my horn. And so it probably doesn't make me a better player, but that's
makes you a more knowledgeable player, if not a better one.
But I taught a course on the physics of music for a long time at San Jose State.
And we're going to explore some of that today. It's pretty fascinating stuff, and in particular, how it applies to brass instruments. So speaking of brass instruments, let's start by asking Brian to play something on a French horn. This is the rondo movement of the third of the four Mozart horn concertos. And Brian, what are you playing this on?
I'm playing this on my regular double horn. It's a Schmidt, but I'm not sure that anybody else in the audience cares. So,
all right, here we go. Mozart.
That's enough.
Marvelous. You can see and hear from this piece that particularly in Mozart's day, it goes in many different directions later on, but the hunting horn is still definitely a part of the mental concept of a French horn in this period of time.
Yes.
So what are the essential parts, and what do we know about what each contributes? You've got bells and mouthpieces and valves. Take us through some of that.
Start you with the trumpet. I want to explain what at this end of the instrument, there's a bell, which is flared. At this end of the instrument is a mouthpiece and a lead pipe. This is slightly conical. And then there's a cylindrical midsection. And all of these have different acoustical purposes, which I will now show you by building a trumpet. Here I have a tube. It's 141 centimeters long, and that's just as long as a B-flat trumpet. However, this particular tube is cylindrical, and if I try to blow the instrument, we have a problem there. We often say that we blow a brass instrument, but that's useless. Watch what happens if I just try to blow a trumpet. Nothing happens. You have to put some sound in, which I do by buzzing my lips. But when I buzz my lips into this tube, let's hear what happens. You hear a whole
Explain how you get those different pitches.
Well, as I blow, I find that the instrument guides my lips. Let me show you. I'm going to sit on, I'm going to go, but listen to how the instrument responds. It goes stepwise from one resonance to another. And the reason is that the tube is somehow controlling my lips. You may look at the open end of a brass instrument as being where the sound goes into the room. But the interesting thing is only a tiny portion of the sound goes into the room. Most of the sound reflects and goes back up the tube. And so when I go into the instrument, I'm emitting high and low pressure puffs of air. Those go up to the end and they reflect and they come back. And as they bombard my lips, if a high pressure puff hits my lips, it opens them and is reinforced. And if a low pressure puff hits it, it closes my lips further. And so the tube is controlling my lips by feeding back acoustical information to it.
If you had a tube that was shorter, how would those pitches be affected?
They'd all be shifted higher. Let's see if I can show you that. So here's the original tube. Now I'll take this part off. It's a little hard to tell, but each of the pitches I played in for the long instrument was made higher when I took off the end there.
So the pitch depends on how tight your embouchure is and how long the tube is.
Yes, but it's necessary for the tube to feed back information to your lips. If all the energy went out of the tube into the room, then none would return to the lips and there'd be no control of the sound. And the returning sound would not draw extra energy out. So it's curious. Only about 1 or 2% of the acoustical energy in a trumpet leaks into the room. The other 98% interacts with the lips and controls them.
Could you play that tube without a mouthpiece?
Well, this isn't actually a mouthpiece. This is the rim of a horn mouthpiece. You have to understand that when I started studying horn with Harry Shapiro in Boston, I had a lip. But 2 years later, I had an embouchure.
Ah.
And if I take my precious embouchure and put it with a sharp metal piece of pipe against it, then it's rapidly converted back into a lip. And so at this end, I just put the rim of a horn mouthpiece to cushion my lips. But this isn't really a mouthpiece because it's not as deep and it's not as narrow as a real mouthpiece. It's just a cushion.
So a well-designed mouthpiece protects your lips, and it also gives you a little better feel for the feedback that you're getting from the resonance in the tubing.
Yeah, I'll show you in a moment what the mouthpiece actually does, but it's like a Coke bottle. If you blow across a Coke bottle, you hear this sound. And if you blow into a trumpet mouthpiece, there's a certain characteristic sound that really resonates. And but what I want to show you, I mean, this doesn't really act like a trumpet. You can hear that the tone is very weak and the instrument is somewhat out of tune. But at the front end of a trumpet, what you have is a trumpet bell. And I can add the trumpet bell to this tube without actually changing the length. Let's see there.
Mm-hmm.
And so listen to what happens before I have the bell on and after. Now we put the bell on. And you should have noticed that it got louder.
And it sounds like a trumpet.
It's a lot more like a trumpet.
Yeah.
But also each of the pitches got higher. And it's still not quite in tune. I can try it to do a bugle call. It's still not quite in tune. So why is it louder? Well, here's the deal. Suppose a sound wave goes down this tube right here. As it hits the open room, you see, the sound can only go along the tube. But in a room, it's like throwing a rock into a pond. The ripples spread in all directions and the sound waves spread in all directions. So in this narrow space, all of a sudden the sound wave has to travel from going axially along the tube to spreading in all directions. And there's a very brief space for that to happen. And it's much easier for all the sound just to reflect rather than to change itself suddenly into a sphere.
Yeah.
But if you have this gradually flared bell, then as the sound goes along, it gradually gets larger and larger. By the time it reaches the end, it's a lot larger sized. It's still not room size, but it's more room size. And therefore more of the sound gets into the room.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's interesting is that the pitches have been changed too.
So one of the other parts that you would want to have to turn this into a more utilitarian trumpet?
Well, Mitch, at the far end of a trumpet, what you have is the bell. What do you have at the near end of a trumpet?
Mouthpiece.
Well, that's true. I was hoping you'd say a trumpet player, but
Well, how about a horn player?
well, all right. When I buzz my lips like this, you hear it sounds a certain way. But if I buzz my lips into the mouthpiece, it sounds different. And what's going on is that this thing has a certain volume to it. And the volume is like the volume of a Coke bottle. In this case, the Coke bottle frequency of the mouthpiece is near 600 cycles per second. So the difference between this sound and this sound is the second sound has a lot of energy added near 600 cycles per second. That's somewhere near a high A, somewhere around in there. And so that's the stridency of a trumpet. Mm-hmm. You can make the instrument milder sounding by having a deeper mouthpiece. Here's a trombone mouthpiece. So you can hear that the Coke bottle frequency, well, here's how to hear the frequencies. I go like this, you hear that sound. If I do that with a trombone mouthpiece, you can hear it's lower. Yeah. And you're hearing the Coke bottle frequency. So there's the frequency at which this emphasizes sounds. So that's one thing that the mouthpiece does. But what you need to notice too is that there's a lead pipe that connects from the very narrow part of the mouthpiece to the wider part of the cylindrical tubing. Mm-hmm. And notice that I can do this connection without actually changing the length. If I show these things before I put them on a trumpet, there's two resonances of the straight tube. Here's the same thing with the mouthpiece and lead pipe. So you can hear they both were raised, but they also were edgier sounding. Right. So when I put this instrument, when I put the mouthpiece and lead pipe on, then this is what it sounds like.
Fantastic.
So the result is convincingly like a trumpet because but you see, you need the bell in order to make the instrument be loud and to raise the pitches of the tones, and you need to have a mouthpiece and lead pipe to add the stridency that comes from the mouthpiece and to also make it play in tune. Not all the notes are in tune. Listen to this low note. There's one note in that family that doesn't quite belong.
Right. But that family is the only one that you can play with that length of tubing.
That's right. And so this explains why trumpets have bells and why they have mouthpieces and lead pipes. Let me see if I can find my trumpet. There we are. Nope. Here we are. Now here are all the same notes played on a regular trumpet. But if I push down the second valve, then what happens is that I have this detour. And this detour is 6% of the length of the instrument. And therefore it takes the sound 6% longer to go from one end to the other. And therefore that tends to lower each pitch by 6%. Watch what happens. I'm going to play open notes and then I'll push the second valve and you hear the change. it's still the same
It's
pattern.
it's as if you had that original trumpet, the long single tube, but now added some
Yep.
inches of tubing onto it, and therefore you have a different overtone series.
And you can hear what the first valve does. And the third. The patterns are all the same, but lower as you add more and more tubing. And that's what goes on. Now, what if you wanted to make a trumpet with holes in the side? After all, that's a strategy we use when we have a woodwind instrument. I put holes in the side. As I uncover the holes, the instrument gets higher because the instrument is no longer extended from this end to there, but it goes from here to the first hole.
Right.
Well, suppose I was to put a hole in the side of a trumpet. Luckily, by a miracle of American engineering, I can do this. Now, when I push down the second valve, instead of the sound going out the bell, it's going to come out the side right here.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll hear that the sound is degraded because it's no longer being processed by the bell.
Right.
So here are the open notes. And now I push it on the second valve. And so you hear that the instrument is very different in quality. If you wanted to build a trumpet with holes in the side, it might sound like this. By the way,
Right.
notice that last one, how I could bend it with my lips. That's a sign that it's not controlling my lips nearly as well as the regular trumpet does.
Right.
Now,
And you as a musician, you want to be able to make each note in the phrase sound the same so that you have a beautiful evolving phrase with the same color.
yes. Now, Mitch, you do seem to be unusually gullible. Since I told you couldn't possibly make a trumpet with holes in the side and showed you why it would sound bad, I present you with this object. You notice it has a bell right here. No, there's the bell. And it has a mouthpiece and lead pipe. But instead of valves, it has these holes in the side. First, just the open notes without using the holes. Just like a trumpet. Now I open the holes. Now that sounded fairly uniform in its quality to me.
Yes, it does.
Yet when I put a hole in the side of a trumpet, it didn't sound uniform. Is this thing actually a trumpet? And the answer is no, it's a bugle. In American English, we use the word bugle to mean any valveless trumpet, any valveless brass instrument. But in English, the proper use of the word bugle is for any conical instrument. This instrument works uniformly because it's a cone. If I open a hole in the side of a cone, everything upstream is still a cone. So putting a hole in the side doesn't alter the shape of the instrument.
Now that looks like a very interesting and possibly old instrument. What's its history?
Well, this instrument was made in England in 1835. It's called a keyed bugle. The keyed bugle was the principal soprano brass instrument in the period from about the time of Napoleon up to the beginning of the American Civil War. And there were actually a whole family of instruments like this. The serpent was a bass instrument made of wood and conical in its profile. And the ophicleide was an attempt to improve on the serpent, but not a very successful attempt. But these were all brass instruments played with a brass mouthpiece, using the lips as the sound source, but having a conical profile and keys on the side. If you go to YouTube, you can find some very interesting performances on the ophicleide and the keyed bugle.
And we still see the term ophicleide in scores of, let's say, Berlioz, for example. They're almost always, not always, but almost always now played on a tuba. But those instrument designations are still in the scores because that was the instrument that Berlioz, for example, was familiar with.
It's very instructive to listen to an orchestra where they actually play with the original instruments. I think the most interesting example to me is the overture to Midsummer Night's Dream, where there's these passages where the woodwinds are dancing and strings are dancing high above, and the and the low brass instruments goes ba, da, da, da. And it's played on the tuba, which is a very mild, smooth, mellow sound. And that's not the way an ophicleide sounds. The ophicleide has a very nasal sound and is much more obtrusive and represents much better than the tuba the characters in Midsummer Night's Dream that Mendelssohn was imitating.
Yeah, yeah. And in Midsummer Night's Dream, he is imitating donkeys and other, the colorful characters from the Shakespeare in a very pictorial way. So that is absolutely what he intended. There's no question. So, all right, we've talked about the pieces that build a trumpet and what each part contributes. And we've seen something that operates differently, a keyed bugle. We started off with a French horn, but the French horn that you played for us is the modern offshoot of something that came earlier. So let's talk about its origins.
The horn originated as a hunting instrument. It could be traced to King Louis in France was a passionate deer hunter, and Baron von Spork came from Bohemia with a couple of his servants who played horn. And Louis was so enchanted by this that he insisted on having horn players taught in his court so that they could join him in the hunt. Why would you want to have musicians along on a hunt? Well, you hunt deer in a forest and you can't see what's going on. But if somebody can see that the stag has been trapped by the hounds, then there's a special call that you can make. Or if the stag jumps across a stream, there's, the different stages of the hunt are signaled.
And similarly, bugles were used well all through the Civil War in this country and for many generations prior to that in Europe and the United States, to let soldiers know what their direction was and what their commands were, because the sound penetrates and it provides information.
Yes. Now the thing is this: the English did not do the same kind of hunting that the French did. The French hunted deer, whereas the English hunted, they hunted foxes when they weren't hunting the French. But the English had a different kind of hunting horn. It looked like this. It was very, very short. It could only do one note, and that note you could bend. So it sounded like this. And now this is very convenient because it's very small. The French instrument was in several turns so that it wrapped around the player's body so that the horn wouldn't be harmed unless, of course, the huntsman was knocked off his horse. But when instrument makers in London came to make horns in the French hunting horn style, they didn't call them hunting horns, they just called them horns. But the horn that was very long and wrapped around your body, they called it a French horn. Whereas, in fact, this is, you don't want to call it an English horn, because the word English horn has some other meaning. This particular fox hunting horn was made in Pakistan, so we could call it a Pakistani horn. But it's a very different kind of instrument. The English is the only language where my instrument is called the French horn. No other nationality blames the instrument for being associated with the French. Although the Germans sometimes called it Waldhorn, meaning hunting horn.
But usually we just see horn.
Yeah. So the instrument was adapted by Baroque composers like Bach and Handel to be played. I don't have a Baroque horn. There was almost 100 years of development between the hunting horn days and the Baroque horn days, and the instrument was played. This, of course, is not a hunting horn, but the instrument was played with a bell up. And And if now I happen to have a piece of tubing in here, which allows the instrument to be played in the key of E flat. If I don't want to play in the key of E flat, then I have to reach into my box of tubing. And here, for example, is a shorter piece of tubing, which is in F. And so for each key you want to play, you have to have a different piece of tubing. These pieces of tubing are called crooks, which has nothing to do with our judicial system at all. And
I'm going to show a picture now of a whole bunch of crooks laid out on a table. And,
yes, and the uppermost crook you can see is the A crook, which Richard Nixon said he was not.
and
now,
then
this instrument is not a Baroque instrument. This particular instrument
has been fixed. So it's no longer Baroque.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That joke is unbelievably funny in the original Swedish. This horn is the kind of horn that Mozart or Beethoven would have recognized their orchestral players as using. And the instrument, instead of being played up like this, was aimed downward, and the hand was inserted into the bell.
For what reason?
Well, you don't want to know what the players were doing with their right hands before they did this. But here are the open notes. You can get tunes. But not all the notes in the harmonic series are in tune. When you hear a modern player playing a supposedly Baroque horn, you'll often see that they have tiny holes which they manipulate, which they open or close, and those tend to make the out of tune notes play more in tune. However, there's no evidence that Baroque horn players ever did this. None of the surviving instruments has holes in it. Arsen's Encyclopedia of Music mentions that if you put a hole in the side of a brass instrument, you can change the intonation. But he says, but of course, nobody would do this because it degrades the quality. Now, what happens if you put your hand in? Well, let me show you. You can hear that the sound gets lower in pitch, and it also changes quality. Before, if you try to play this really up with the bell up, that's not going to work because then your hand has got to go in and out. But instead of relying on these open notes, I can try to get all the notes in between. Let me see if I can show you how my hand works. And so the instrument becomes fully chromatic by using this hand technique. Not all players at the time of Mozart and Beethoven were very skilled at this, but the very best of the players, such as Leutgeb, for whom Mozart wrote his Horn Concerto, and Giovanni Punto, for whom Beethoven wrote his celebrated Horn Sonata, were very excellent. In fact, there are a diarist who listened to the premiere, somebody who heard Punto give a recital, remarked that people in the audience were looking off stage to see if perhaps there might be a singer, and that perhaps Punto was only miming the piece so beautifully that he sang with his instrument. And so here, for example, is the opening of the Beethoven Horn Sonata. Do it again. So you can hear some of the notes I have to shade with my hand. of course, I don't do this when I play really loud, because when I play really loud, then the quality of the covered notes and the open notes diverges. And so instead of playing loud like that, horn players learn to play more discreetly and, unlike trumpet players, with taste, so that the instrument is still not really uniform in its quality, but the goal was to, for example, the open notes have the hand there, so that muffled sound then
Right.
became part of the aesthetic, what was desired for the sound of the instrument.
So if we're looking at a Mozart symphony or a Haydn symphony, we know that that was the instrument, something like what you're holding in your hands was the instrument they were writing for. True for Beethoven, and true even for earlier Brahms. So at what point do we start to move into the modern horn?
Well, the valves were invented around 1825. The same player who played the famous fourth horn solos in Beethoven's Ninth also played the first performance of Schubert's song Auf dem Strom, which has an elaborate part for valve horn and in it. But it's not clear that the player used that horn for Beethoven's Ninth, though it has quite intricate hand horn work to it. So say about 1825, the earliest valves came in, but the earliest valves were kind of leaky and the horns were expensive. And so it took a long time. Now Brahms learned horn when he was young. And so although he almost always heard his music played on valve horn, he was always thinking natural horn. The most famous case of that is his horn trio for horn, violin, and piano. It has a very advanced natural horn part. When he toured with the piece, he insisted that it be played on natural horn, even though by the time of the 1860s or 1870s, the technique had been lost. Nevertheless, that sound was what he wanted. And I mean, when you listen to the Beethoven, that next to last note is not only out of the harmony, but it has a different tone quality to it. Now, if you listen to the same solo played on the modern horn, that note no longer has that special quality. And
yeah,
if the composer is asking for a certain expressive effect because of the covering with the hand, then that's lost by the quite uniform sound that you get out of the modern horn.
And there we come to an issue that is very important in the last 30 or 40 years of the 20th century and into the 21st century. There are schools of musicologists and performers and audience members who like to hear a Brahms symphony or a Haydn symphony, for that matter, played on the most uniform, most technically accomplished instrument, a modern instrument, and those who would prefer to hear those pieces played exactly or as much as we can replicate the instruments that were the same ones with the same technology that Mozart would have expected to hear or Beethoven would have expected to hear. And there's that question about performance, early music performance practice or classical music performance practice. And I think you're going to give us an example of how that horn concerto, the rondo of the third Mozart horn concerto sounds played on a natural horn.
So you can hear some of the notes are covered. There's one place I think where Mozart calculates the effect of covering it. The horn goes like this. Sorry. That's a very special note. And I think that note will always sound a little strange. And to me, it sounds strange if you play it on the modern horn because it's not special the way it is.
Yeah.
In Mozart's time.
So there are really distinct advantages to hearing these pieces played on the instruments that they were designed to be played on. And there may be advantages in terms of the lyricism and the warmth of sound and the uniformity of sound that you could get on a modern horn.
Yeah, I remember the first time I heard Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique played by Roger Norrington, and an orchestra was playing all authentic instruments. I had played the piece several times before, and I was driving as I was listening, and I didn't recognize any of it because all the instruments were so different, not just the horns, but the strings and the bass, the ophicleides. They make the instrument a very different experience. The piece is a very different experience and much more scary. I don't think Symphonie Fantastique sounds very scary in a modern performance, but when you hear it played on instruments where the players are really struggling just to have them sound, it's really quite a splendid exercise and very different.
The string instruments will have gut strings. They won't be played with so much vibrato. There's a much smaller but edgier sound. And the woodwinds don't have the same key systems, and they don't have the modern reeds. Yeah, it winds up being an utterly different sound quality, and it does have a certain kind of edginess to it.
The other thing is that the pitch is different. The pitch at the time of Mozart and Beethoven was lower. When we hear a Mozart opera sung at modern pitch, the high C that Mozart wrote is much higher than he envisioned. And so unfortunately, they haven't modernized humans the same way they've modernized horns. And so it's more of a struggle for those players to sing the extreme notes.
Yeah, as the string instruments had pieces written for them that required more and more brilliant technique and flashy, superhuman kind of, with Paganini and beyond Paganini, the Brahms concerto, the Tchaikovsky concerto, the players wanted to be able to project this very brilliant sound that emphasized those qualities in those pieces. And they went to metal strings with maybe a gut center, but metal wound around. And they changed the string length and just produced a much more brilliant, much more penetrating sound. And that's the one that we have come to get to know. But when, as a result of that, the quest for a more brilliant sound brought the pitch up over time. And now we typically play at, well, if you're a European orchestra, you might play at that A equals 440 cycles, or 440, European orchestra probably 444 cycles per second, or even 445, which is what Berlin does. American orchestras more typically at 442 or something like that, but A equals 440 became the formula.
I remember about 30 years ago, the Berlin Radio Symphony toured through San Francisco, and their pitch was 444. And so they called on a piano tuner to tune one of the pianos, and the piano broke.
Yeah.
They couldn't get it up to that pitch. It wouldn't hold it. And the strain on the instrument was too great. And so I forget what they had to do instead. Yeah.
And now that's not so unusual anymore. European orchestras are here all the time, so they have to have pianos that work. And American orchestras' pitches are creeping up too over time. I don't know, as time goes on, we get bigger cars and higher pitch instruments. It's something in the acquisitive nature of humankind.
Well, I think too, there's something about human hearing that makes the tendency for the pitch to rise. If you have a group of people in an orchestra play the note C in various octaves, the high instruments will tend to play naturally a little bit sharp. It actually sounds better sharp. But if the lower players notice that, then they will tend to chase the pitch north. And so that's one reason why concert pitch in an orchestra tends to go up.
That's right. And also pianos are tuned so that the highest notes are actually tuned down just a couple of cycles and the lower ones up just a couple of cycles to meet in the middle somehow.
I'll disagree with you. You got it backwards, but you're right. The octaves are stretched so that the high C on a piano is actually much higher than you'd expect. But it sounds better that way.
Yeah, we're accustomed to those more brilliant pitches. So not only brass tubing can be made to sound like something, and I think Brian is now getting ready to show us a couple of other instruments.
Brass instruments aren't. It's not the brass that matters. It's the sound source, and the sound source is the lips. So they should be called labrophones, but we won't call them that. But here's a non-brass instrument played with the lips.
And of course, we know that that instrument has, yes, that instrument has a lot longer tubing than what we see out front.
Yeah, the profile of it is conical, sort of like the keyed bugle.
Right.
And I think you're about to try to get me to mention the Alp horn.
I am.
And the Alp horn I have, which we'll show you a tape of, is just as long as my open French horn. And you've already heard me play the open notes on a French horn. But because the instrument is conical, it has more sound gets into the space outside the instrument, so it's a fairly loud instrument. The Alp horn was used to summon cattle across Swiss valleys, and
it's made of.
It's made of wood. It's not made out of Alps.
And it's usually a pretty soft wood, I think. Isn't that the case?
I haven't studied that. I just simply bought an Alp horn that I could afford, and the horn player that I bought, who made it for me, was actually a house carpenter. That was his trade, but he had switched into making Alp horns. But yes, I imagine it's fairly soft wood.
So let's take a look at what that looks like and sounds like. A pretty impressive instrument. How long is that Alp horn?
It's about 14 feet long. It's the same length as the F horn that I play, but it's more impressive because it's not all wound up.
And what we heard there was just the overtone series that you could organize into a melody. And how well does that work on an Alp horn?
Show them.
All right. So this is Brian playing his Alp horn in a melodic setting. Lovely. And then it is possible to put an entire ensemble of Alp horns together, and you get quite a gorgeous sound. Let's see if I've got this ready to go. Listen to the echo. Pretty amazing.
I hope you noticed that that piece of music was in F sharp. That's the traditional tuning of Swiss Alp horns, and does much to explain the musical isolation of Switzerland from the rest of Europe.
Aha. Amazing. So that's a very resonant, elegant sound. What if you use a piece of tubing that is less. Okay, let's start with a garden hose.
My garden hose. You notice that I have the bell is this wonderful funnel, and oops, I've lost it. So here's what it sounds like.
Amazing. And we're going to conclude this by talking just a little bit about Brian Holmes as composer. Brian has written some of the most interesting premieres, new pieces that the Peninsula Symphony has performed over the last many years. My favorite was a gigantic piece for large chorus, for children's chorus, for one single soloist, vocal soloist, who was called Amherst Requiem, a piece that we performed at Stanford University. There it is. And the soloist was then a local singer just beginning to be known elsewhere, named Heidi Melton, who has more recently been performing at with the Vienna Phil, the Mariinsky, the Berlin Philharmonic. She sang in the last Met Ring cycle, and she has sung at Bayreuth. So we really caught a very lucky moment there and got her to sing that most impressive and very beautiful and very touching piece, set to poems by Emily Dickinson. So that's one end of Brian Holmes' compositional output. And then, because as you've already seen, Brian has a quirky and marvelous sense of humor. It can work towards the other end as well. So here's a little bit of a piece that Brian wrote for garden hose, soprano. Who are the performers here? This is called, this opera is called Fun with Dick and Jane.
And the aria is called See Spot Run. And the garden hose figures in the plot.
How does it figure in the plot?
You obviously haven't read the book Fun with Dick and Jane. No,
So,
Dick, as I recall, is busy watering the garden with his garden hose when Spot jumps on him, and the water ends up going to a place which really embarrasses Dick a whole lot. And so that's when Spot starts chasing after Dick. And Jane sings this wonderful aria.
Here we go.
What about Dick?
This is from the teacher's manual.
Does he look happy?
Garden hose. Short excerpt from See Spot Run by composer Brian Holmes, French hornist Brian Holmes, Professor Brian Holmes, and our guest here today. Any concluding words about what we've talked about today, Brian?
No. However, if anybody feels that they actually understood anything that I said, let me know, and I'll find a way to express it so that as to be more incomprehensible.
Well, that will fulfill your obligations as a professor. It's always fun to talk to you. You're enlightening, you're entertaining, and you're a wonderful musician on a lot of levels. Thank you, Brian Holmes.
Thanks, Mitch.
For this wonderful excursion into the world of brass instruments and music in general. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.